Welcome to Week 7 of World Literature 1. Our topic this week is relatively simple and easy to understand. Can you detect my sarcasm? Here we are, just like a few weeks ago, when we read the Ramayana of Valmiki, confronting texts that hold dear religious significance to millions and millions of people worldwide. This is the week that we read portions of the Christian New Testament and several surahs from the Islamic Qur'an. My purpose in this lecture is to introduce you to these works as literature. Many of you are already familiar with the religious and theological aspects of these sacred texts. As we discuss them, please understand that we will keep the focus on them as works of literature. Their narratives, their literary elements, their themes. It's when we stray into life application that we leave the realm of holy texts as literature and veer off into other arenas not suitable for literature class. We reach another landmark this week. We are now entering into the Common Era, leaving the before Common Era, or BC, behind us. Instead of presenting pages of background information on Judea at the time of the Roman Empire, or Arabia in the late 6th and early 7th centuries CE, I've linked 2 crash course history videos on the Week 7 instruction page. These got relatively good marks from users, unlike the online material on the Ramayana. I want to begin the Christian New Testament section of my lecture with a little demonstration on interpretation and how it is tied to both context and the culture of both the writer and the reader. It's always a good idea to keep the context of the original work in mind when reading sacred texts, or any text for that matter. Here is a famous passage, Jesus' parable of the prodigal son from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 15, included in your Norton Anthology, but not in this week's assigned reading. I'm using the King James Version, by the way, Luke 15, 11 through 16. And Jesus said, "A certain man had 2 sons. And the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the portion of goods that falleth to me. And he divided unto them his living. And not many days after the younger son gathered all together, and took his journey into a far country, and there wasted his substance with riotous living. And when he had spent all, there arose a mighty famine in that land, and he began to be in want. And he went and joined himself with a citizen of that country, and he sent him into his field to feed swine. And he would fain have filled his belly with the husks that the swine did eat, and no man gave unto him." This part of the parable tells us of a son who asks his father to give him his inheritance before his father dies. The son later finds himself in want, as the King James Version relates. Why was the son in want, and why did he end up in a pig pen? Most Americans would say it was because he wasted his substance in riotous living, verse 13. This seems pretty straightforward, right? However, a study done by Mark Powell said how you interpret this parable depends greatly on where you're from. Powell notes that Russian Christians interpret this passage a different way. Noting that there arose a mighty famine in the land, in verse 14, Russians blame the natural disaster for the son's bad circumstances. A third reading comes to us from Tanzania in East Africa. The Tanzanian Christians note that the son took a journey into a far country, and none would give unto him. He had none of his own people around him. I have traveled in East Africa to the edge of the impenetrable forest in southwest Uganda, and I can tell you that our African friends treated us with great hospitality, even delaying the start of church for an hour so that they could serve us African tea and a meal. They were more concerned with honoring us as distant travelers who were visiting them than they were concerned about punctuality. You see how this mindset interprets how they interpret this parable. And could you imagine an American church delaying services for an hour? Absolutely not. So who's right then? Which interpretation best encapsulates the original intention of the author? Is it the U.S.'s view, which also represents the majority view of Western nations? Is it the Eastern European view? Is it the African view? Are none of them right? Or are all of them right in some way, but more of them are right if they are all together? That's the richness of these 6 short verses. We can find many reasons why the prodigal son is struggling. I hope this demonstration clears up how we bring our own life experiences with us when we interpret any kind of literature, but especially holy books. Let's talk about the Gospel of Matthew. First, in our discussion of the Christian Gospels. What is a gospel? It's a genre of Christian writing that relates a narrative of Christ's life and teachings. There are 4 of them in the Christian tradition: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Other Gospels exist, like the Gospel of Thomas, but they are not considered part of the biblical canon. Scholars disagree on the dates and authorship of Matthew, and as I'm not a biblical scholar, I am not going to reveal my view in this lecture and just present the normal or the main views. Some scholars argue for an earlier date of composition for Matthew, between the late 50s and early 60s CE. Irenaeus, a 2nd century CE church father, please excuse my puppy in the background, stated that Matthew was written while Jesus' disciples, Peter and the Apostle Paul, were still alive. Both probably died between 62 and 64 CE. Other scholars contend that Matthew was written later on, between 80 and 90 BCE, after the destruction of the temple at Jerusalem. And the diaspora, since the text clearly deals with a cataclysmic event befalling the city. Whether it's making a prophecy or recording history is a matter of interpretation. What about authorship? According to church tradition, Matthew, one of Jesus' original 12 apostles and a former tax collector, is the author. The book would not have been named after him at first, most likely because he wrote it for his own congregation, and would not have needed to identify himself as the author. Historical documents from the time period or the following century are unanimous in citing Matthew as the author. It has similarities to the Gospel of Mark, but Mark was a close associate of Peter, another of the original 12 apostles, and used Peter as his source. Some recent scholarship has advanced the idea that Mark's Gospel, the shortest of the 4 Gospels, was added onto later with material from an unknown additional source scholars call M. However, for convenience, I'm just going to refer to the author as Matthew. Matthew was written in Greek, though some think there may have been an earlier version in Aramaic. Most scholars agree that Matthew's audience was Jewish Christians who were being pushed out of the larger communities located in northern Galilee or Syria. The first audience may have been a community of Christians in Antioch in Syria, but the manuscript quickly circulated to other churches. Because of his mostly Jewish audience, Matthew focuses on the kingship of Jesus, while emphasizing the wrong thinking of the Pharisees, one of the prominent Jewish sects at the time. In keeping with this largely Jewish audience, Matthew uses many Old Testament quotations. His book mixes several narrative subgenres, like birth stories, calling stories, miracle stories, parables, etc., with discourses, the sections where Jesus is teaching. Scholars have noted that there are 5 major discourses in the book of Matthew, perhaps as a deliberate echo of the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament that were written by Moses according to Jewish tradition. Thus, Matthew presents Jesus as a fulfillment of the law and Moses. The first and most famous of these discourses occurring in Matthew is the Sermon on the Mount, found in chapters 5 through 7 and part of your assigned reading. Christians will find many familiar passages here, including the Lord's Prayer and the Beatitudes, that section of the Blessed are the meek, etc., at the beginning of the sermon. Some scholars think that the sermon was a collection of sayings later consolidated in this one place, while others think that the sermon was given in one sitting as a coherent, continuous speech. Taken as a whole, the Sermon on the Mount addresses the important question, how are the citizens of the kingdom of God to live? In setting this sermon on a mountainside, Matthew is presenting Christ's teachings on the Sermon on the Mount as a fulfillment of Moses' deliverance of the 10 Commandments on Mount Sinai. Jesus also presents his sermon using an Aristotelian structure, something you may have learned in English 1301 or 1302, including such features as a narration of facts, propositions, examples, and an emotional call to action. I've also asked you to read the opening of the book of John, the fourth gospel, and one that is very different than Matthew. Although most Christians, whether biblical scholars or not, have regarded the Apostle John, not John the Baptist, as the author, some nowadays wonder if the book was written later by one of John's associates from John's recollections. This would explain, according to this viewpoint, why the gospel seems out of step with the other gospels, the so-called synoptic gospels. The book was likely written sometime between 70 and 100 CE in Ephesus, an important Asia Minor city during Roman times, with those arguing for a different author than the Apostle John, setting the date at the latter end of that range. John's audience included both Jews and Gentiles, non-Jews, in the wider world of the Roman Empire. We know this because the book explains some of the Jewish customs that an entirely Jewish audience would not have needed to be explained. In terms of literary features, John contains the typical subgenres of narratives found in Gospels: calling stories, miracle stories, parables, etc. John emphasizes expanded discourses, heavy with symbolism, as we will see in this first chapter. Recurring motifs in John include the number 3, the number 7, the theme of misunderstood statements, and contrasts, like light versus dark, love versus hate, to name a few. There is some evidence that the opening lines of John 1, verses 1 and 2, were actually drawn from an early Christian hymn, according to Pauline. We see the chiastic structure present in Job with John chapter 1, which begins with the idea of the Word with God and ends with the idea of the Word with the Father. At the center of the chi, or X, is the main idea, found in verses 12 and 13, that believers become children of God. Many have noted the echoes of Greek philosophy in John's Gospel. We see many tie-ins with Plato, who lived in Greece around 400 BCE, and the Stoic philosophical school in John's Gospel. Like Plato referencing Socrates, John presents himself as a beloved pupil present at his master's last symposium. This link to Plato is borne out by the fact that the oldest surviving manuscripts of both John and Plato's symposium were found together in Egypt, written on papyrus. First century CE Jews were certainly reading Plato, and early Christians were interested in Plato's work, especially his Apology and Phaedo, which deal with Socrates' trial and death. Plato had many, many beliefs. Some of them still capture imagination today, like the analogy of the cave. Others, like the Republic, are largely deemed of little use to modern society. One of Plato's main themes was the elevated ideal. This is called Plato's theory of forms, which he explained with his famous analogy of the cave. I'm linking a short video on that in the resources section because it's an important idea in Western philosophy, although it won't show up in any quiz in this class. What is more real? Plato asks. The actual flawed things that we see every day, or the ideal versions of those things? Plato viewed God as an ideal, much more elevated than was traditional for ancient Greeks, whose gods, as we saw in the Iliad, were not above acting just as capriciously and immorally as mortals. But how could this ideal being interact with his imperfect creation? Plato's answer was that a word could be existing that could communicate with God because of his own righteousness, but yet was humble enough to interact with mankind. The Jewish thinker Philo expanded upon this idea, calling the word God's firstborn. Do you hear any echoes in John? So we see John in his gospel drawing on the ideas already circulating in the secular world as a way to reach his audience of non-Jews in the gospel. Let's move on to the Qur'an. As when I briefly touched on the context of Christianity's birth as a religion, I will refer you to the crash course video for background information on how the Qur'an came into being and how Islam spread from its roots in Mecca and Medina on the Arabian Peninsula. Like the development of the New Testament texts, you will find lots of information about how the Qur'an came into being as a book in the Norton Anthology Introduction. Just as Christians view the works on the Old and New Testaments to be God's work, Muslims believe the Qur'an to be God's word, but revealed to the Prophet Muhammad via the angel Gabriel. A big difference between the Qur'an and the Old and New Testaments involves both dating and authorship. The Qur'an was revealed over a much shorter period, just over 20 years, between 610 and 632 CE, and it was revealed to just one human author or conduit. Muslim scholars, both Sunni and Shia, generally agree that the Qur'an was written down after Muhammad's death. Understand that Arabia of late antiquity was a predominantly oral society, and that few people were able to read and write. For that reason, the Qur'an would have been memorized and recited until it was written down. Until recently, the Qur'an has not been seriously studied as a literary work, but fortunately, this practice is changing. According to Mustansir Mir, most traditional Muslim scholars would not have considered the Qur'an to possess unity or coherence, but this view began to change in the late 20th century. Most previous discussions of the Qur'an's literary features were inseparable from theological considerations. So we find ourselves walking a road less traveled here, which is wonderful for literary scholars who are expert in this field, but kind of scary for the non-experts, and also for puppies. There is no long tradition of scholarly commentary on the literary aspects of the Qur'an, but I'll introduce a few things to look for as you read Surah 24 and 31. First off, the Qur'an is the first work of literature written in Arabic. Thus, it had a profound influence on that language's development. Due to the shortened time period of production, so to speak, the Qur'an is shorter and not as varied in terms of genres represented as the Hebrew and Christian scriptures. For instance, there are no lamentations or acrostic poems. We do see some key literary elements of the Qur'an, however. Figures of speech, satire, irony, and Arabian similes, to name a few. You'll find a nice Arabian simile, in Surah verses 35 through 40, which is in our assigned reading. You can see how these are really speaking to native desert dwellers, but we can still understand them today. There's also parts of the Qur'an that feature something called rhymed prose. Not technically poetry. In Arabic culture in the 6th and 7th centuries CE, poetry was associated with untruthfulness. Therefore, we do not have sections of Qur'an that rhyme poetically in Arabic, and these sections are instead categorized as rhymed prose. There are narrative sections in the Qur'an, as there are in the holy books of the other Abrahamic religions, Judaism and Christianity. However, the Qur'an incorporates these narratives in the context of a didactic point. For instance, we see the story of Abraham scattered across several surahs, 6, 21, 51, and 60, because the Qur'an is organized thematically instead of by story, like you see in Genesis, where the story of Abraham is presented in one fell swoop. These stories are used to drive home the point that it happens to be making in that particular surah or in the section of it. The Qur'an also includes dramatic dialogues as an important genre. There is a division in the tone of surahs depending on where Muhammad was when he received the word from Gabriel. The so-called Meccan surahs, received roughly between 610 and 622 CE, are more poetic and rhetorical, and the Medinan surahs are more discursive and matter-of-fact. I'm sorry that I don't have a lot of specific guidance for you here as you prepare to read these two surahs. When scholars say that there is a lack of academic discussion about the Qur'an as literature, they are absolutely right. I'm a pretty decent researcher, but most of the academic works I found were dissertations from the last 5 years. That's how new this field is. My searches in one database for both Surah 24 and Surah 36 yielded absolutely no results. I was shocked. I hope that in a few years' time this problem will be remedied. Unfortunately, it will not be remedied by me, not being an expert. I don't know enough about the Qur'an myself to know which .org or .com websites to trust, and most of those searches pulled up theological interpretations anyway, which would not be appropriate to this class. I chose the two surahs, 24 and 36, out of our anthology for particular reasons. Surah 24, or Light, is a Medinan surah, and so, according to Mir, more pragmatic and intent on direct teaching. Surah 36 is known as the heart of the Qur'an. It is a Meccan surah, and it's also known as Yasin, which means, O thou human being. As you read, ask yourself why Muslims may consider this surah the heart of their sacred text. If you are a Christian or a Muslim and you are reading the Bible and the Qur'an, you will find similarities between the two scriptures. Gabriel Said Reynolds argues that the Qur'an is in conversation with the canonical Bible, but also those post-biblical and pre-Quranic Jewish and Christian writings, which became part of the repertoire of sacred history among Jews and Christians. Just as John's Gospel was a product in conversation with its own time period strains of thought, so the Qur'an engages with those earlier monotheistic religions. It is an original literary work in its own right, of course, and since there was no Arabic translation of either the Jewish or the Christian Bible at the time, there's no way Muhammad could have drawn directly from those scriptures. But we definitely see echoes. There are no direct quotations from the Bible in the Qur'an, although you will see some similar imagery and wording in places. But there's no denying that several characters familiar to Jews and Christians make an appearance in the Qur'an, including Noah, Abraham, Joseph, the son of Jacob, John the Baptist and his parents, although he is not called John the Baptist here, and Mary, mother of Christ. Reynolds postulates that about 1/4 of the Qur'an engages with these figures. Other familiarities or similarities with the earlier sacred texts include the Qur'an's cosmology, which means idea of creation, its use of parables, the existence of prophets, and its discussion of legal matters. The residents of the Arabian Peninsula would have been familiar with Syriac Christians, a branch of Christianity focused on the Middle East and India and based historically in Iraq. Finally, I'd like to talk about the Islamic influences on Christian Europe, or some of them at least. When the religion first began to spread, it spawned a reaction among some Christians in Constantinople, now Istanbul, to destroy religious icons. Islam takes the commandment to make no idols very seriously. This practice of destroying what was once considered holy, in terms of the icons of saints and Christ, is known as iconoclasm. We also see Islamic influences in some early medieval Christian artwork. I'm showing a slide here of the Lindisfarne Gospel, a beautiful illuminated manuscript of the Bible dating from the late 7th century CE, less than 100 years after the death of Muhammad. This art style of the decorated letter is called carpet page, after the beautiful Turkish carpets that used Islamic motifs of vegetal patterns, based on flowers and plants, and abstract patterns. We will continue to see Islamic influences on the West in literature in a few weeks when we read several frame stories. And if you're familiar with Spanish at all, Arabic definitely had an influence on the Spanish language. Many words, and I've just picked 3 very common ones here. Algodón, which means cotton, loco, which of course means crazy, and the word ojalá, which you see the word Allah in, which in Spanish means I hope. That's all for now. Check out the resource section for more details on the sources I've consulted for this lecture. And thank you for your patience. I don't think that recorded. I just want to cry.
If you need some space, feel free to go up and use Ian's room.
Yeah, I think I'm just going to have to, I'm going to try one more time, but I need to make sure.